Squander Knobs, a short story. Our hero receives tuition in metaphysics one fine but spare afternoon. Salubrious wafts of new-mown grassy aromas perfumed the shonky veranda where our hero, Miller, reposed with the ever-musing Brainy Carboon. It was a sundry day, casual and lofty, and the sky was as flat as a meadow. Across the long road, bathed in prosperity, was the conference centre, and there assembled the annual motleys of cunning youth, an influx of postgraduate agitation making light of the year and discussing in earnest their theories and designs. The topic this year was how to waste taxpayers' money. The keynote speaker, a professor flown in from Vanuatu with an entourage of 6, was speaking on why the taxpayer is such a chump, but the main course of action was merry delivery, expensive cocktails, and evening frolics of wild biology. Anyone who's ever been to an academic conference knows the procedure. The students file in to register, listen to a paper or two, and then run amok within the ambit of the hosting town. This was no different. There were cars and minibuses, flags and posters, and 200 hairy scholastics dedicated to saving the common man from his dreary nothingness, playing stunts, and messing up the otherwise tidy and unadventurous rural mellow. "Squander Knobs," said Brainy, gazing in disdain. He had his feet up on a flower pot. Miller could but agree. Every year the conference-goers made a coarse debacle, but he had other things in his mind. "I was wondering," he said, making curious and ignoring the goings across the divide, "if you would care to elaborate yet further on your prior ruminations on the nature of the infinite." It was a good question, and Brainy had his share of ideas. Miller was an inquisitive number with an inkling to resolve. "Ah," said Brainy, "I see." "I didn't understand your bold distinction," Miller admitted. Brainy watched, and at that very time a small truck pulled up. It was directly in front of his house, and a team of rough nuts in grey overalls, lanky and loose, descended, armed with shovels and iron bars and jackhammers and steely-poked two-headed road picks. "The distinction," he said eventually, "is between the indefinite, or the never-ending, and the actually infinite, which is singular and without necessary qualifications." Miller took it in. On the street, the ostensible workmen constructed an orange-tape safety rail and started chopping into the roadway. They seemed to know what they were about. One of them redirected traffic. "Are you saying," asked Miller, "that the infinite is without limits altogether, and to qualify it in any respect is to impose a limitation?" "You might say that," said Brainy. In fact, he himself did, on many occasions, and in so many words. "You can't say," he said, "that there is infinite time or infinite space. Time and space are indefinite, certainly, but the infinite is beyond them both. If you say infinite space, then you are imposing a limitation, namely the category space, and the infinite is then not really infinite, but merely indefinite in magnitude, if you see what I'm tickling here." Miller wasn't sure he did. He suspected that something with absolutely no qualifications is actually nothing, but he wasn't prepared to say so. "Necessarily one?" he ventured instead. Brainy moved to a side to see the street work better. There were 5 or 6 athletic sods hacking into road base, possibly searching for a pipeline or conduit with deliberate and mechanical haste. The road workers themselves were handy and surly and bored, and took turns leaning on the spade-handled log. "It's a question of economy," Brainy said. "The Ocker's razor. One is all you need." At this point he stood up with some sudden understanding. "Let's go for a walk," he announced. It was a rare eventuality. It took a lot to move Brainy from his shonky veranda. Miller was happy to comply. walking extenuates the inner grey cells, and the afternoon was nicely ripe with possibilities. Brainy admitted he was weary of the tedium and needed a rapid cure. They walked down the steps, through the gate and off into the neat parcelled sunshine with the rich country air doing wonders in their nostrils. "You hear it all the time," Brainy complained as they ambled. "People say time is infinite, or space is infinite, or there are infinite probabilities, when what they ought to be saying is indefinite, and referring to indefinitude instead." Miller considered the prospect. "But space is without limits, isn't it?" he opined. He motioned skywards, alluding to the great blue beyond. "Perhaps in itself," said Brainy, "but that only makes it of indefinite extension. It is limited necessarily just by being space, and not something else." "So," the Miller figured, "the infinite is everything then?" "Absolutely," said the Brainiac. It was a proposition chunky with paradoxes, but Miller was happy to give it a whirl. They walked and talked over the clarifications, with Brainy displaying his acumen with understated rectitude. He wasn't called Brainy for nothing. You could catch him on the shonky veranda most afternoons, and he would discourse on tricky issues. Infinity was definitely tricky, but he had it sorted in the accordion file of his mind. "You have to stop thinking of the infinite as a thing," he told Miller, "when in fact it is everything. You're standing in it." Actually, neither of them was standing, but rather strolling, until at last they emerged before the police station, blue and white and full of dark windows, edged to the fore by blooming hydrangea and a scruffy lawn. It was a slow day. The station almost looked deserted. Brainy next explained the finitude of thingness. As he pushed open the door, sauntered inside, and Miller, perplexed, did follow. He was left, however, gazing upon a huge wall poster illustrative of your garden variety cannabis plant, and urgings to tell the constabulary on their hotline should you see one. Brainy was met at the counter by a man in blue. "How can I help you?" the man in blue asked. His tone of voice insisted otherwise. "I just think you should know," began the brain calmly, "that there's a bunch of those students disguised as road workers digging up the road in front of the conference centre down there, just as a lark." The officer looked up. He was suddenly interested. "Is that so?" he inquired. "Indeed so," said Brainy. "You know what they're like." The officer took control of his senses and called to the room at the back. "Did you hear that, Max?" he yelled out. "There's a group of those Squander Knobs, dressed up as road workers, ripping up the roadway." Max came rushing out. He was older and fatter. "I knew they'd be up to something," he said, eager. "Last year they stole the statue of the little boy lost from out the front of the library." The two of them sprung into action. Brainy and our hero said they were relieved and sauntered out again. "Things, by definition," added Brainy, "are of finite extension, but even more so in themselves, inasmuch as being a certain thing means that they are not some other thing, you see?" Miller was still slightly wonky on it all. "I think so," he said. "So you mean this is not true of the infinite? Is that what you're saying?" "It is," said Brainy. He was pleased. They took a shortcut through the park. Differentiation is, finally, an illusion. Miller wanted to object that would make him Brainy and Brainy him, since they indeed are objects in space and time, or seem to be. He hesitated in his folly, though, since the first lesson of wisdom is to think before you flap your rustic tongue. The sunny day was trembling with bird song anyway, and who can argue with that? He also wanted to revisit the proposition, tangling him in knotty frameworks, that being, therefore, is the only thing that is. The afternoon seemed too concrete for that. "Where did you learn all this anyway, Brainy?" asked Miller. They headed down the road to the golf course and its dogleg, and then back towards the shonky veranda. Brainy said what he always said. On the back of cornflakes boxes, Miller. The thinking man reads at breakfast. When they reached near the gateway, though, Brainy dodged the danger signs and, with a smooth demeanour, did approach the road worker posse and had timely words with them as well. "G'day," said the foreman, throwing up his chin. Brainy said hello. "I just thought you should know," he began, "that there's a bunch of those students disguised as policemen coming down here to tell you to move along, just for a lark." 3 other diggers pricked up their ears. "What?" said the foreman. "A bunch of them dressed as cops?" "The very same," Brainy confirmed. "You know what they're like. A young bloke with handsome upper arms yielding a shovel with pointy bits came across and reminded everyone that students had stolen the statue of the little boy lost in the previous year, the Squander Knobs. It had never been recovered." "All right," considered the foreman, turning back to Brainy and Miller. "Thanks for that." He was prepared. Brainy and Miller, duty all ended, walked away. "The thing is," Brainy then continued, "that things aren't really things. They only appear to be." Miller saw the long and the short of it, but it didn't make the shonky veranda any less real. They retired there anon and took up their chairs equally real, refreshed from the sunlit perambulations. The same salubrious odours wafted in. Farmers on the outskirts of town had just been slashing hay. It was a rainburst to the nose of wonder-struck thinkers. It was what the earth had planned for the entire afternoon. Brainy put his feet back up on the flower pot and thought that Miller was possibly making progress. "But the infinite is a thing, isn't it?" asked the Miller, ponderous. He had his mind wrapped around it like a butterscotch in cellophane. "Not as distinct from some other thing, it's not," said Brainy, correctful. "Otherwise, it's the only thing there is. Self-sufficient, ineluctable, perfect." Perfection. Now there was another tricky issue. Miller wondered if cornflakes had anything to offer on that. "And only one," he sought to confirm yet again. "Yes, yes," said the brain, twice. He then expounded that all objects, let us say the flower pot, have sundry qualities that be merely accidental. There is only one abiding trait, and that be the very act of isness. He didn't think it terribly difficult to grasp. Miller wasn't altogether convinced, particularly in this latter proposition. Wasn't there other schools of thought on the matter, he surmised? Brainy admitted that there were, but said he thought of them as nuff-nuffs. Miller said, "I see." It was during the meditative impasse that followed that conclusion that, down on the street, a bevy of constabulary duly arrived, blue and eager and full of mean rural swagger. The road workers tarried and looked up thoroughly forewarned. There was little movement over at the conference centre, but on the roadway action took a turn. "There are the atomists," Brainy confessed eventually. He said it with displeasure and as an afterthought. There was even a philosopher named Epicurus, he related, who supposed that just one atom did a right-hand turn for no particular reason, and this made the flower pot exactly as it is. Bizarre, Miller agreed. Brainy nodded and sat back to watch in comfort as the police crew assailed the roadwork 6. The shonky veranda was far too away to overhear what was being said, but there was evident remonstration and a bit of shuffling boots. The fat cop, Max, aimed his belly at a tall man with a motorised asphalt pounder within his dual-handed, brawny mitts. A young hothead stepped forward. Various people pointed. It became clear soon enough that there was a lot of pointing at the conference centre and by implication at the 200 tax wasters, then in session, known well for their prankish ways. The foreman was vociferous. He wasn't fooled. He not only pointed, he waved. Our hero, Miller, watching serenely, did surmise then that Max had told the boys to move along, precisely as Brainy had predicted. The workers stood their ground. Then again, thought Brainy, having a recollection, there is the school of Harry Clytos, who lived in a cave and died of manure, who says the universe is all in flux and the only constant is change. Miller nodded now. It was news to him. He would need to think it over. On the street front there was altercation. The police weren't taking any nonsense, and they wanted to know, quite furthermore, the whereabouts of little boy lost. "It's only the flip side of a coin," said the brain. "On the other side is only the one, and it is, and ever was, and will be, and is all packed into a tight little ball as big as everything, and never changes a single itty bit, ever." He took a coin from his pocket as an example. He flipped it in the well-scented air. "Heads it's one, tails it's many," he presided. Just then, in a sudden escalation, as negotiations failed, a rust-headed road crusher had enough, evidently, and swung his shovel into a police officer's head. Responding, the others took out their truncheons, and it was on. Tails. Many. And the many went for Biff. It was, if nothing else, enormously entertaining. Because, in order to be infinite, Brainy Carboon did proceed, it must contain all opposites, to be or not to be, so to speak. And whilst we might imagine one and many to be mutually abortive, each is implied in the other, just like love and strife. Miller almost got it by the curlies. "I see," he said, and he did. These opposites flip into contrary standing. That was something he could understand. The worker of the handsome upper arms held off 3 officers with his pointy shovel. There were whistles and shouts. Others came running. A small crowd of conference dudes, Squander Knobs, assembled on the far curb and cheered on the road workers, the brave proletariat resisting police state oppression. But one of the cops, far-sighted, stood out from the affray long enough to radio for assistance. Eventually the system would prevail. Futility slowly dawned. The foreman was a feisty man who never backed away from a barney. Max, on the other hand, sought revenge for little boy lost and was in no mood for easy solutions. But some of the combatants understood bits of the misunderstanding. So it seemed to Brainy and Miller up on the shonky veranda, sniffing at the dense aroma. Brainy was happy again. He had found his rapid cure. He took his feet down off the flower pot and prepared to journey to the kitchen. "A cup of tea?" he asked Miller. "White with one," said our hero, looking up in the Brainy direction. It was a good selection. When Brainy brought it out, steaming in a crisp china cup, he glanced out to where the constabulary were by that time subduing the workers into division vans, and the students across the way were booing on behalf of the coming revolution. He handed his friend his hot tisane and couldn't help but conclude. "The one is like the sugar in your tea," he analogized, "everywhere and no more here than there, and the whole sweetness of existence." That was straightforward enough. Miller sipped the pleasant beverage and appreciated the comparison, and he noted all the more the afternoon's fine splendour, the gorgeous wafts of grassy mowings, and the cosmic juxtapositions at the taxpayer's expense, playing out in micro on the roadway of vast.